Good morning, everyone from Washington, D.C., and happy Halloween. My name is Emma Chanlett-Avery. I'm the Director for Political Security Affairs and the Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Asia Society Policy Institute. This morning, over the next hour, we're going to review and assess Trump's excellent tour through Asia, his 5 days in the region. During this trip, Trump appeared to revel in his role as the statesman, greeted by Malaysian dancers and cheering troops. The Tokyo Tower lit up in red, white, and blue. Gourmet meals catered to his very taste. In fact, the only snub he encountered along the way was from Kim Jong-un, who, despite his overtures, declined to meet with Trump during his time in the region. So along the way, Trump collected certainly an array of golden souvenirs, but what else did he bring back to the United States in terms of trade deals, which were top of mind, or other diplomatic wins? We have an excellent panel here this morning. I'm going to briefly introduce them. And a reminder to the audience that you can submit questions through the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. So first we have a couple of colleagues of mine from the Washington, D.C. office, Wendy Cutler, who is the Senior Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute, along with Shay Wester, who is ASPI's Director of Asian Economic Affairs, as well as our Outreach Director. And just to keep us all honest, we have a journalist with us as well, Ye Hee Lee, who is the Tokyo and Seoul Bureau Chief for the Washington Post. So with that, let's dive right in, and we'll start at the end with the Xi-Trump summit and the trade announcement that came with that. Let's go to Wendy initially. Wendy, what is your take on this announcement? What do we know about it? It seems like Beijing and Washington both saw the need to take down the temperature a bit on the trade war, but give us your assessment of what this looks like from what we know today.
Well, thanks, Emma. It's really my pleasure to join such a distinguished panel. We have a lot to unpack this morning, so I am going to try and be somewhat concise, but I do have a bit to say about the China deal. First, as you mentioned, this was the final meeting of what I would characterize as a very successful swing through Asia, and we'll unpack that. But it's not just the deals that were announced, and a lot of them were, but it was really kind of the meetings he had, the personal chemistry the president developed with other leaders, and really spending like 5 days or 6 days in the region, attending the ASEAN and APEC, and then meetings as well as going to Japan. So hats off to the president and his team for spending so much time in such an important region. And particularly for the Asia Society, we think this is the region. And so very, productive week. So the China deal. And first, let me just say that there's nothing in writing yet. And so what I'm going to say is really based on what's available thus far. And as things are put into writing, we may see more details and we may be able to learn more about not only what commitments were made, but what is the sequencing of these commitments and the implementation of these commitments. So I want to make 5 observations, and I'll kind of do this pretty quickly. First, as you mentioned, Emma, this is a de-escalation pact. That's the way I see it. And if you look back to where we were in January with China, in many respects, except for an additional 20% tariff, we're kind of back where we were. So there was a lot of escalation, and now we have de-escalation, and in fact, what looks like a 1-year truce. But the measures that were announced and unwound, most of them have been imposed since the president took office. Now, the question is here, as I say, this is kind of a 1-year truce, the way it seems to be written. And the question everyone's asking already, is this going to last? Will there be flare-ups? Will there be fundamental disagreements that will lead to its unwinding? Or, as the president said, will this just be rolled over every year? And that's something that everyone can speculate on. My personal view is there will be flare-ups, and particularly during 2026, when the U.S. Hosts the G20, China hosts APEC, and the president's planning on a trip to China in April with Xi Jinping coming to the States next year. I think there's going to be a huge incentive on the part of both countries to keep this détente and truce intact and perhaps to build on it. My second observation is we're dealing with a very different China now than the China Trump dealt with in 1.0. And why do I say that? Everything that China's doing now is tit for tat with the United States. We announce an escalatory measure, they come back and escalate, with very little time between our action and their countermeasure. And so, in my view, with this truce, if the president, let's just say, were to threaten higher tariffs now, the Chinese are going to come right back in and say, well, you know what? Our critical minerals regulation is going to go forth. And so I think this is going to tie the president's hand, particularly with respect to using tariffs as a threat. My third observation, again, it's a one-year truce, but it's going to be very important how each country uses the year. And why do I say that? Because we haven't resolved the fundamental differences between the US and China. And so China's going to be using this year to further develop self-sufficiency, to diversify its trading partners. And for the United States, the critical initiative that the US needs to pursue is to find and develop alternative sources for choke points with China, particularly, but not limited to the critical minerals area. Fourth, 2026, as I mentioned, a lot will go on between the US and China. And the question will be, is this truce all of it, or will both sides try and build on the commitments during 2026? And my final observation, and here I'm sure Shay will elaborate on this, but what is the impact of this deal on the rest of Asia, particularly Southeast Asia? And why do I say this? I think on one hand, countries in the region are welcoming this de-escalation in tensions. However, what will need to be seen is somehow does China end up in maybe a more advantageous position through this deal and truce than particularly Southeast Asian countries that are negotiating very detailed agreements with very strong provisions on how they should treat third countries within their borders and how they treat those products of countries that may find their way to the United States. So let me stop there.
Wendy, thank you. That's tremendously helpful. And we don't have a readout on the official deal. Is that right, from the White House? So we've had to rely on Beijing's version of the talks?
Just Beijing. I mean, the president, Jameson, Greer, and Besson have come out now with some comments. But again, there are no fact sheets. There's nothing. I don't think there's any agreement between the U.S. and China in writing, or at least we haven't seen it. So again, this may be an evolving situation, but I think the contours of the deal are pretty well known. And again, I'd say the tit for tat nature, if you were going to develop a scorecard, everything the US did, China got paid for. And so it's very, I would say, kind of balanced in that respect.
Great. Well, it keeps us on the edge of our seats at any rate. Thank you so much, Wendy. Michelle, let's turn to you and talk about Japan and South Korea. They, of course, had trade deals of their own with some lingering questions. But we're looking for some security assurances and a sense of where their alliances are at. So we had a brand new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi. Why don't we start with Tokyo and talk about how you think the outcomes of that first initial encounter went?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be a part of this very timely discussion. It's been a lively time out here in Tokyo and Seoul, or Gyeongju. I think overall it was a great outcome for Sanae Takaichi, the prime minister who just took office. It was her first test at diplomacy. She doesn't have formal foreign policy experience, but as soon as she became prime minister, she was really thrown into these big, high-profile diplomatic stages, first at ASEAN, and then, of course, with President Trump, then President Lee, and Xi Jinping. I think the biggest win for her really is that the two leaders started on a good footing, and by the end of President Trump's time in Tokyo, they were extremely chummy and friendly, and he was leading her down the stairs. She was jumping up and down, cheering with the U.S. troops at Yokosuka and fist pumping. It was like, a little bit of a new type of energy that we're seeing from a Japanese prime minister. But, she got off on a obviously very friendly footing with President Trump. They watched baseball together. And I've been kind of joking, but it actually has seriousness. The ghost of Shinzo Abe really did a lot of heavy lifting there. The two of them immediately connected, talking about the former prime minister, the good friendship that President Trump had with Abe, and then the fact that Takaichi really models her policy viewpoints and her political career after Abe in many ways. And so I think they kind of got off on a good footing in that way. And then, of course, came the Nobel Peace Prize nomination intention, and then the golf club, golden golf balls. But I think beyond that, there were a couple other strong points. One was that Takaichi was able to convey to President Trump that she really wants Japan to bolster military capabilities and accelerate the revision of the 3 key national security documents to strengthen Japan's defense. She talked about wanting to reach 2% of defense spending by the end of this fiscal year, which is a more accelerated time frame. And President Trump responded very favorably to that. And I think importantly for Prime Minister Takaichi, President Trump didn't mention any new percentages on host nation support or defense spending. And I think doing something like that would have put her in a difficult position because she's such a new prime minister. She faces a difficult political environment domestically, and she hasn't really hashed out any of these details around defense spending. So I think kind of throwing out those numbers could have made it politically difficult, but they avoided that. They kind of all broadly agreed that Japan would increase defense spending. Pete Hegseth also reinforced that, Defense Minister Koizumi as well. So they all were on that same page. So I think for now, Takaichi has really bought some time when it comes to, building this relationship with the U.S. She's now going to have to hash out the details herself, how to figure out how to get that money for the 2% of GDP defense spending and how to make that within the accelerated time frame. I think, there was one interesting moment where kind of we saw that early goodwill play out, which was that President Trump initially wasn't intending to attend the event with the families of the Japanese abductees. We were in the White House pool. We were told that, he wouldn't be going to that event. It was going to be Secretary Rubio only doing a photo op. But and you can kind of understand from President Trump's perspective, he wants to meet with Kim Jong-un. The last thing he probably needs to do is take a photo and have a big moment with the abductees. But according to Japanese media, it was Takaichi who sort of convinced him to show up at that photo op, and he did. And he spent some time with a dozen families of abductees, and I think that really shone through. So I think there's been some divided reaction at home about whether Takaichi maybe have gone too far in showing all of her enthusiasm being with President Trump. Like some opposition lawmakers have made it a point to say, maybe she went overboard in intending to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize and all that. But nonetheless, Takaichi is in a really high point at the very early honeymoon period in her prime ministership.
Yeah, thanks for that. Michelle, we were together actually in Tokyo a couple weeks ago, and it seemed even tenuous that she was going to be elected prime minister. So my sense is that she may have bought some time with her public as well from the success of this visit.
Right. Yeah, I think so. And I think it was going to be a very big test. The first big global stage that she was going to face, and I think she did a very good job overall.
If I can just add, because I was in Tokyo, I just got back last night, and just to underscore what Michelle just said, but the excitement in Tokyo, for the visit of by President Trump, you could just feel that vibe, a lot of excitement, and frankly, I think by the end, a lot of a sigh of relief because the prime minister was new to the world stage. And I think the view was she did an incredible job, really held her own. And there's, that personal chemistry seems to have been developed. And I think that for Japan, this is their, the U.S. is their main, it is our major ally in the region. And I think there was unspoken concern that maybe this meeting wouldn't go as well as Trump's meetings with Abe. But again, you could just feel the excitement on the streets. And in the hotel I was staying is where the president and his team were staying. Lots of people there hanging out, waiting to see anyone from the U.S. delegation.
Then all that the fanfare and security, that was just for you, Wendy, looking for the president. Um, so good vibes all around in Tokyo. Michelle, you are going to do double duty here, and let's move to Seoul, or I guess to Korea, to Gyeongju. Talk to me about how you saw the Lee meeting with Trump. They obviously had a pretty successful initial meeting too here in Washington. But the talk about where they went, how that went diplomatically, and maybe if you could particularly talk about the surprise announcement about, well, as Trump phrased it, allowing South Korea to have a nuclear-powered submarine and what we know about that deal at this point.
Yeah, well, for President Lee, this, like you said, this was his second time meeting President Trump in person. I actually thought it was more positive than that first initial meeting. The initial meeting was, very much like a hello, get to know you, real quick get together. But this was Lee in his element, more hosting President Trump. He outgolded the golden age that Takaichi presented by giving Trump a gold crown. It was all about gold golf balls and golden age in Japan, and then Trump comes to Korea, and it was massive gold crown replica of the Shilla dynasty that he presented. And, President Lee really leaned into the peacemaker idea during the diplomatic engagement. It was all about peace. And, obviously for President Lee, he wants to frame it within the issue of engaging with North Korea, really supporting Trump reaching out to Kim Jong-un this time, trying to meet with him. There were peace lilies on the table. There was, the crown was symbolizing a period of peace on the Korean Peninsula under the Shilla dynasty. So they really leaned in heavily there. And of course, presenting President Trump with the honor of the Order of Mugunghwa, which was the highest honor of the Korean government given to a U.S. president for the first time. So I think all the theatrics around that obviously put President Trump in a happy place, and he responded very well. But I think the biggest win probably for the Lee government was that they resolved some of these details over the $350 billion investment fund, which had been really just deadlocked. They had been deadlocked over it. And even the day or two before the summit, it wasn't clear if the two sides were going to be able to reach that point. The South Korean negotiators were kind of projecting that they may not be able to, but South Koreans were able to get the U.S. to walk away from the idea of an upfront cash payment and make the payments into more of a decade-long process, capped at $20 billion per year. And I think that was a big win for the South Koreans. And then another big win, obviously, was what you mentioned, the nuclear power submarine. Although there are so many details that need to be hashed out, just like the trade issue with U.S. and China, there is nothing in writing. The only thing in writing here is Trump's Truth Social post, which said that he gave permission for South Korea to build a nuclear submarine. So if we took that literally, does that actually mean one nuclear submarine? Does that mean more? You start reading between the lines, but you don't get very far because there's not much there in that announcement or really a social media post. What President Lee said publicly during the bilat was that he wanted the capability for South Korea to have fuel and to, reprocess spent nuclear fuel and enrich uranium for nuclear-powered subs. And he said that this would help South Korea counter other nuclear submarines in the region, particularly maybe from China and North Korea, and also lessen the burden on U.S. For South Korea's defense, which was clearly appealing to Trump's desire for allies to take on more of the burden. But beyond that, we don't have any details. We don't know. For example, President Trump said the nuclear submarine would be built at the Philly shipyard, which Hanwha now runs. But the Philly shipyard is not one of the two places where nuclear submarines are being built in the U.S. So trying to move it to Philly shipyard means you have to repurpose that entire shipyard to be able to have nuclear submarine building. And that means permitting, licensing, getting nuclear capable staff there. And then it means revisiting the 123 agreement to see how, they're going to have to work on the legalities and technicalities of revisiting that agreement. It has to get congressional approval. So there are so many more steps, not to mention bigger issues with proliferation and all that. And we can talk about that more later. So that was a big announcement, but such a huge question mark. Finally, I think it was interesting that the defense spending cost sharing issue didn't come up publicly as we kind of thought it would. We thought it would be a sticking point that might come up, the alliance modernization and kind of seeing where the role of USFK is going to go, whether USFK is going to be facing more toward China rather than just the North. These are really big sticking points right now, but that didn't at least publicly bubble up in their announcements. So they avoided that part. But, I think overall, it was a good second meeting between the two leaders. Lee Jae-myung probably built some goodwill with that massive foot-tall crown and, hosting President Trump in his home country here in South Korea. So I think it did go well, and I'm happy to talk more about the nuclear submarines later on as well.
That's tremendous, Michelle. Just thank you for that comprehensive view. You deserve all the fun size Halloween candy that's out there in Tokyo in the hours ahead. Okay, so let's get a male voice in this room and turn to Shay. ASEAN, it's their moment. I feel like we hadn't had a lot of indication of how Trump was viewing Southeast Asia, at least in this term. So how do you think that his stop in Kuala Lumpur went? What was the reception of the countries that were there at the ASEAN summit? And please, if you can tell us a little bit more about this Thailand-Cambodia peace deal that he signed along the way. Your turn, Shay.
Thanks, Emma. So, yeah, a male voice, but also a voice at least speaking to Southeast Asia, a region that I think a lot of times gets lost amidst some of the other larger players in Asia. But yeah, I would just start by saying that I think that just Trump's attendance at the summit itself was significant. U.S. presidents have only appeared at two of the last ASEAN leaders meetings over the last 8 years. Biden only attended virtually once. So, in Southeast Asia and in ASEAN, showing up is really important. So I think that some of the optics around the visit and just showing up helped to mitigate some of the skepticism about the administration's commitment to Southeast Asia. Before we talk about the peace deal, I'll just note most of the meetings really centered on signing reciprocal trade deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, as well as trade frameworks with Vietnam and Thailand, as well as some critical minerals agreements. So I think that just really highlights that much of the emphasis was on trade, economics, and commercial deals, rather than some of the other larger strategic issues that are sometimes at play, like the South China Sea, for example. I think that the optics with the leaders kind of building on some of what the other speakers have said about Trump's kind of building those personal relationships. I think you saw some of that taking place as well during the Southeast Asia leg in Kuala Lumpur. Um, this is a small thing, but if anybody hasn't checked it out, just Trump dancing with the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar Ibrahim, was something, and I think again kind of showed some kind of personal connection there. And I think I'll say you got to give some credit to Anwar. He took a really high risk bet, inviting Trump, saying that he was going to attend, and managed to pull it off with having some concrete outputs and not having things go off the rails in any way. There were some protests and the like that you did see in Kuala Lumpur, but things seem to more or less be not too out of hand on that front. On the ceasefire or the peace deal and Trump's role in it, this is a longstanding border conflict between Thailand and Cambodia, and it turned deadly in May, and really became an enormous test for ASEAN and their ability to mediate between member states, especially in light of what's been a really challenging situation in Myanmar, and you've seen ASEAN not be able to address that conflict successfully. So we saw Thailand and Cambodia signing this expanded ceasefire on the sidelines with Trump overseeing it. They committed to things like withdrawing heavy weapons and releasing prisoners, landmine removal, and also accepting an ASEAN observer team. And Trump, I think really, of course, has tried to take credit for it. I think that Malaysia also played a key role in in these negotiations and bringing both parties to the table. But I think just the pressure of him coming and did lay the groundwork for to kind of build on this truce. And it's very unique to see a leader using tariffs in order to force parties to the table in a situation like this. I think one other thing to note and something worth watching is that it is kind of looks to be opening up some space for U.S. Cambodia rapprochement. Trump has agreed to lift the U.S. arms embargo and to restart a defense exercise. Also, more cooperation on addressing the issue of scam centers, which is a real challenge in Southeast Asia. So I think we could see that relationship evolve in a country that's really historically been very close to China. So just maybe one final thing I would note is that beyond Trump's presence and all the U.S. deals, I think that it was important to see, or just to note that ASEAN and Malaysia really are also diversifying and widening their focus. They invited and had the leaders of Brazil and South Africa there. The EU spoke, which was not something that we've traditionally seen. And then you have other tracks happening with the GCC, with Canada, with a number of other countries. So I think it's interesting to see some of these ASEAN working to both diversify while negotiating these agreements with Trump. So I will stop there, but it's been really interesting to watch this visit.
Great, terrific, Shay. And it seems like ceasefires is emerging as a theme here. Ceasefires on the border, ceasefires on trade wars. So let's hope that these endure. I'm going to turn back to Wendy, staying on the trade theme here, looking at the other trade agreements, and particularly the Korea deal that seemed like it really came together very last minute. And I'm wondering if what you see as the key provisions here, and if this is helping us sort of turn the page on the Hyundai raid, where hundreds of South Korean workers were arrested. Where are we at with the Koreans now on this deal?
So before the first Trump, after the first Trump-Lee meeting, there was an agreement in principle. And now it seems we have a framework agreement, but we still don't have anything in writing. So again, I'm going to do the best I can in terms of interpreting all this. Look, I think Korea was just under enormous pressure to conclude a trade deal during this visit. And why do I say that? It's because all the, its competitors and other countries in the region had concluded deals. And so Korea was an outlier without a deal, and frankly, was at a competitive disadvantage, particularly with respect to autos, where Korea still has a 25% tariff. I still don't think it's been lowered, while its Japanese competitors are facing a 15% tariff. And so a lot of pressure. Second, this was the action forcing event. If Trump and Lee could not agree to a trade deal during this visit, it was hard to see how the momentum could keep up, particularly given all the intensive negotiations that have been happening around the clock in the lead up to this meeting. And so I think there was incentive on both sides, but particularly Korea, to just do this deal and get the best terms it could. Now, Michelle mentioned, and I couldn't agree more, the major sticking point was this $350 billion investment fund. My understanding is once Korea read the memorandum of understanding between the US and Japan of their $550 billion investment fund, Korea basically said, we could never agree to this. And President Lee said, I would be impeached if I agreed to something like this. So it appears that he did get better terms, but I'm not sure that this part of the deal is really out of the woods because it is very controversial. At the end of the day, the United States will be making decisions on how the money from Korea will be spent in the United States. And so we'll have to watch this very carefully. But this wasn't the only kind of controversial provision for Korea in this deal. Remember, Korea was a free trade agreement partner of the United States. And just about 6 months ago, it had zero tariffs, in terms of its access to the United States. And so my sense is, and when I hear from my Korean colleagues, there still is a bitterness about, the FTA commitments kind of being put aside and Korea being treated like other trading partners in terms of, what it could get from the United States. With respect to semiconductors in particular, I was a bit surprised that Korea didn't get like a 15% guaranteed tariff if indeed new tariffs are announced on semiconductors like Japan and the EU did. Korea now is it supposedly in this deal will be given the same treatment as Taiwan here. And my sense is those tariffs are going to be higher than the tariffs that the EU and Japan may face. So look, I think, again, Korea had no choice but to do this deal, but I don't think it's being welcomed the way it may be, other trade deals in other parts of the world are being welcomed. And again, I think when we see the details, and particularly this deal is going to have to go through the National Assembly for approval, even though the National Assembly is the same party, the same progressive party is leading the National Assembly as in the Blue House. I think, there still could be some controversy getting this through.
Great, thank you, Wendy. So much was about trade in this trip, of course, but we had plenty of security dynamics going on in the background, including the nuclear sub deal that we talked about before. We had President Trump announcing that he was ordering the Pentagon to resume nuclear weapons testing. And of course, we had North Korea shooting off a missile right before the Trump arrived on the peninsula. So, Michelle, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you see Kim Jong-un's position right now. And he was the man not in the room there, did not respond to President Trump. Seems like North Korea is sitting in a really different place than it did several years ago, too. So just give us your sense of how North Korea is looking at this, and what might lie ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a quick addendum to what Wendy said about the Korean trade deal. The South Koreans said they lowered the auto tariff to 15% from 25%. So
Yeah,
that had been,
they absolutely did.
they
But
did, yeah.
my point is, it's still not implemented yet. Like the deal
Oh,
will
no.
need to be done, and my understanding is that tariff reduction will not go into effect until Korea actually submits legislation to be considered by the National Assembly. But yeah, they did get down to 15% on autos, but not semiconductors.
Yeah, and I think the issue of National Assembly is going to be tough, like Wendy said. Emma, you mentioned the ICE raid. The ICE raid is still an issue that National Assembly members are talking about, and they're still holding, some of them, the progressive members are holding protests. So that's not gone away at all. On North Korea, I mean, if I'm Kim Jong-un, I'm feeling really good nowadays because Xi Jinping invited me to his party and I got to sit right next to Xi Jinping and Putin. And then, they came to North Korea for the military parade. And then Trump wants to meet with me and Lee Jae-myung wants to work with me. So Kim Jong-un he's definitely not where he was in 2018, 19, when he was willing to negotiate with Trump and see what sort of sanctions relief he can get. He walked away from Hanoi feeling really burned, and by all accounts, and the world around him has shifted, and so has his view of his place in the world. After the Russian invasion, Kim Jong-un has continuously talked since 2022 about the Cold War, the new Cold War, and about the aligning with the anti-Western led global order and aligning with China and Russia on that. And he has kept to that word. And he, as you know, has been, one of the most enthusiastic supporters of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. And he appears to be getting a lot in return. Of course, we don't have, hard proof of most of it, but if it is true that he's getting all the economic and oil support and food support, and if potentially weapons technology transfer from Russia in return for sending all his troops there, then he doesn't need to turn to Trump for sanctions relief. And Kim Jong-un has said so. Actually, it was last month in September. Kim Jong-un said that he left the door open for meeting with Trump. He said that he had quote good memory of meeting with President Trump before, but that denuclearization has to be off the table. He said he's going to never, ever give up their nuclear weapons. And as long as denuclearization is on the table, he's not going to meet with the Americans, even if sanctions relief is a part of that. So he's put it out there. And what President Trump, he's tried so repeatedly this time to meet with Kim Jong-un. There were apparently Trump administration officials trying to send letters through the UN mission office, the DPRK office at the UN, but have gotten no response. President Trump put out all the word he could through media, on TV, on social media, through print, but Kim didn't respond. And the one thing that he did mention was sanctions relief during this trip. And I just don't think that is exactly what Kim Jong-un is looking for based on what Kim Jong-un has said. Kim said he's willing to coexist in a peaceful coexisting world with his nuclear weapons and with the U.S. if the U.S. is willing to accept that. And President Trump, the official U.S. policy remains that we're pursuing denuclearization. So there's just no convincing Kim on that. We were really wondering if it could be turned around within 48 hours like it did in 2019 when President Trump, after the I think it was G20 or G7 in Osaka, he, said on social media that he wants to say hello to Kim Jong-un. And then there was this last minute scrambling to arrange a visit, and it did happen. There was a handshake meeting at the DMZ. South Koreans were the Ministry of Unification stopped their trips to the DMZ in anticipation that maybe another handshake might happen. But, instead of making that happen, Cho Son-hui, the foreign minister, went to Belarus and went to Moscow. And in fact, so it's an interesting dichotomy because in 2019, when Trump put that tweet out, the person who responded from the North Korea side was Cho Son-hui, and she responded favorably and said, maybe we can work this out. This time when Trump put it out, she responded by going to Moscow and Belarus. And she met with Putin, she met with Lavrov, and she sent along good wishes from Kim Jong-un to Putin. She went to Belarus and delivered a speech bashing the US for its war machine. So it's a completely different environment. And I think we saw that play out very clearly this time. I think the final note I'll say is that with all the talk about a nuclear submarine for South Korea, which could even spark similar discussions in Japan, and then with all the talk about U.S. restarting nuclear testing, even though North Korea has been the only country to do that testing this side of the 21st century, is that North Korea would feel that the region around itself is becoming more nuclear armed, and that puts North Korea in a more defensive and posture. And I think that's probably not, that could be a precarious situation to go moving forward in terms of regional security. But, I think that's just a bigger discussion about proliferation overall. So.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really helpful context. And I wonder if we're going to see down the road, another chance for just a dedicated Trump-Kim summit at some point, giving the mass dancers a little more time to rehearse before Trump would be there. So not to ignore the actual organizing principle of this whole trip, Shay, could you just briefly give us a little bit of what the outcomes were of the actual APEC forum here? I think it's still ongoing, but just quickly, if you could let us know some of the resolutions or at least the agenda of what we're looking at APEC.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Emma. So you're right, it still is ongoing. It's we'll finish on Saturday in Korea. Xi Jinping is still there, and I anticipate that he'll be speaking and kind of outlining what China's APEC agenda will be as they take on the chairmanship role in 2026. So that's something to be watching in the future. I think a few things on APEC itself. First, I think kudos to Korea for during a politically tumultuous time in their own domestic politics for really being able to focus on having the hundreds of meetings that encompass APEC. They are working towards a leaders' declaration. We will see what actually if they're able to agree and put something out and what's included in it. But that said, the really two largest things that Korea's been focusing on this year is first on AI and innovation and putting forward a number of initiatives there. And then secondly would be looking at aging and that challenge and trying to build on to build up some work within the APEC context on that. I think that there's also been some discussion with them pushing for the broad concept of open plurilateralism and looking at using APEC as a practical platform to try and drive implementation of various initiatives, despite a lot of the trade tensions that are taking place. So anyhow, I think stay tuned. We'll see more over the next couple of days, and then, as I mentioned, look to move to the China year.
And if I can just add here, that I think APEC as an organization cannot produce these kind of big deliverables that it did when it was, 5, 10, 20 years ago. And that's largely due to membership. And so a lot of what will come out of this meeting, I suspect, will be maybe some high level principles, but then some very kind of technical, pragmatic work in different areas that is not necessarily sexy, but I would argue really kind of helps businesses in the region trade and pursue economic initiatives and more integration among themselves. And so the APEC outcomes largely now are like kind of the bilateral agreements that are held around the event itself. But one thing I'll be watching for is during these leaders' meetings where the US president will not be at the table. Again, as Shay said so rightly, Xi Jinping's at that table. And so let's see what comes out of that. I think it's kind of a missed opportunity for a US president not to stay for that part of the discussion.
Yeah, rightfully so. I mean, APEC at the very least provides a really nice convening platform for all these meetings to take place. This is a nice moment actually to remind our viewers or tell them that on November 6th, we are having an event in New York on APEC outcomes specifically. Wendy will be there as a moderator, and Kang Kyung-hwa, Ambassador Kang Kyung-hwa will be giving some remarks. So head to our website if you would like to see an expanded discussion on APEC outcomes. You mentioned, she is still there. He's still meeting. He met with Takaichi, I believe, a short meeting there. One area that we haven't quite talked about yet is in this, sort of 1 year pause. I've seen commentary that there's national security concerns about continuing to give China access to advanced technology from the United States. I wonder, Wendy, what's your sense of the national security concerns and the fact that they seem to be like these seem to be on the table in a way that they hadn't been before.
Absolutely. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, one of my main observations here is kind of this tit for tat. US acts, China acts in response. And we've seen that play out on tariffs, but also on the ports issues and other issues. But it's also playing out on the export control side. And I will just say, having been a US negotiator for many years with China, both working for Republican and Democratic administrations, China would always request, if only you relaxed your export controls, then we could balance our trade and everything would be good. But the response was no, these are national security measures. They're not up for negotiation. We're not putting them on the table. China wasn't happy, but again, that's the way it was. This administration has opened the door for negotiating on export controls and export restrictions. And we've seen that play out this week. In fact, for China, one of the price that was paid by the United States for China putting off the implementation of its critical minerals regulation was the US putting off the implementation of its 50% or affiliates rule, which it had announced just about a month ago, which would have allowed the United States to impose export controls to the subsidiaries of entities that were targeted by the United States on national security grounds. So the U.S. has frozen that, that export restriction. We don't know whether there were broader commitments on export controls, particularly in technology, by the United States. But for me, I find it kind of difficult to see the United States going forward with other high-tech export restrictions that will hit China during this year truce period, again, without fearing that China's just going to go right back to saying, well, then we're going forward with critical minerals export restrictions. So in many ways, I think Beijing has set this up very well. There was a question apparently to the president on Air Force One. What happened on NVIDIA chips? Did you give the green light that China can buy these? And my understanding is he responded something like, well, that's kind of up to the NVIDIA CEO to go and talk to China. We may help, but whatever. So it's not clear what that outcome is. But I do see kind of a fundamental shift in how export controls and export restrictions are going to be handled and viewed and possibly, put on the negotiating table by the administration. My final comment would be is that Beijing has been busily at work since, again, Trump 1.0. And one of the things that China did has accomplished over the past 8 years or so is putting into effect a very detailed toolkit where it not only can respond by tariffs if it doesn't like something the United States does, but it can put U.S. companies on its unreliable entities list. There's an anti-sanctions law. But more importantly, it also has developed its own export control law, which mirrors the U.S. law and has been the basis for China, again, restraining exports, not only for critical minerals, but also for other products of interest to the United States.
Wendy, if I could just jump in and mention another aspect here is in the Malaysia and Cambodia trade deals, I thought it was really interesting how broad some of the new economic security provisions were in those agreements, and kind of an attempt to work with those countries to impose some of these types of export controls and other restrictions on. To have them basically align with U.S. policies there.
Great.
That is let me just weigh in. I think that's just an excellent point. And frankly, when I read the Malaysia agreement, I was pretty shocked that Malaysia could agree to not only what it agreed to on export controls and economic security, but also treatment of foreign companies, including Chinese companies, although the word China doesn't appear in that agreement, having to take certain steps against companies from third countries if they engage in unfair trade or if the United States takes a measure against that country. And so it will be very interesting not only to see how this plays out in Malaysia and other Southeast Asian countries as folks focus on the details of the agreement, but how does China respond to these provisions? So far, my understanding is China has been pretty quiet. But I wonder if any of these provisions, then, let's just say once they're implemented, whether that is going to invite China's wrath. And I think this just shows, again, that these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, really feel that they are being pressured by the U.S., by China. They're trying to navigate, through this terrain, but it's getting tougher and tougher.
Great, thanks to both of you. We're kind of getting near the end of the hour here, and I want to take a question that's come in from our online viewers. Michelle, we've talked about Takaichi's sort of diplomatic debut with Trump. But there's a lot of other meetings going on here on the sidelines, including the critical first meeting with President Lee. There had been concern before Takaichi came into office that some of her views on history issues might disrupt that relationship, which had been going well. So if you can talk about how that first meeting went and the prospects for productive trilateral engagement, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee met, I believe yesterday. They had 25 minutes scheduled, but it extended to 45 minutes because they wanted to continue meeting and talking. And the initial meeting was friendly. Prime Minister Takaichi had said in her first press conference that, she likes South Korean things. She likes Korean beauty products and she likes Korean seaweed. And so President President Lee gave her Korean beauty products and Korean seaweed as a gift. And President Lee received, I think, like a Go game set from Prime Minister Takaichi from a sister city of President Lee's hometown. So there was, good gift giving there. What I thought was interesting was that both of them acknowledge that there are unresolved issues between the two countries, but that they have to be looking forward, and that they, as two countries in the same neighborhood, they may have disagreements, but they have to have a future-looking relationship. And I think that is it's a way that they're both starting off their relationship from a more positive angle, trying to separate those history issues that they both feel very strongly about, and then the possibility of cooperation. And I think from both the Japanese and South Korean perspective, it is important for them to set aside whatever the history issues they have with each other right now, because bilateral cooperation is so important, especially given the U.S. being such an unreliable presence right now from a trilateral perspective. It is really up to Prime Minister Takaichi and President Lee to hold together the trilateral format moving forward, because we know that President Trump has never been as gung-ho about the trilateral relationship, even from the first term. There was a trilateral foreign ministers meeting at APEC, I think yesterday. So it is continuing from that working level. But I think it's a good sign that the Japanese and South Korean first meeting, they openly acknowledge that they're going to have, take this two-track approach. I think this is an area where if it starts to go wrong, it can go wrong really fast, especially given how we know how Prime Minister Takaichi feels about this issue. We know the pressures that President Lee faces from his own party and the National Assembly on this issue. They're both navigating very tricky waters domestically. So if something like a territorial issue comes up, I think both sides are going to, double down on it. But for now, we're not there. They had a very cordial first relationship. And actually, their bilat lasted longer than Takaichi's meeting with Xi Jinping. And they made it a point to say that they extended the meeting because it went well. So.
Thanks, Michelle. And next time I see you, I too like Korean beauty products and seaweed, so you should keep that in mind. So
present to you a gift.
Okay, got it.
I like crowns.
Oh, okay. We have those too.
We can arrange for that, Wendy. So we're getting close to the end of the hour, but I want to do a lightning round here where we go around and give some final thoughts here. Shay, why don't we start with you? Is ASEAN back on the map? What's the momentum going forward from here?
Well, I mean, I think that that it certainly to some degree that but the test here is going to lie in some of the execution of these deals. Are Malaysia and Cambodia able to move quickly towards implementation, or could these deals get bogged down? We still have Thailand, Vietnam, as well as the Philippines and Indonesia, who, I think we could all see concluding deals in the next couple of months. And so, I think that's the other key to watch is what kind of pressure do other Southeast Asian countries feel in light of these deals to conclude their own?
Michelle, what about you? What's the diplomatic momentum going forward here? And have we put sort of the Indo-Pacific back in as the main priority of the Trump foreign policy?
Not yet, I think. I think it's a good way to refocus on the Asia Pacific region and get President Trump out here, see him present and show up. I think that was important, and for him to remember that he does have these strong allies in the region who are eager for his presence and for his attention, and for him to prioritize these very important, especially security matters. So I think it served as a good reminder to him, but I think whether he's going to actually focus on these the substance of these issues, we'll have to wait and see. And he's gonna want to come back and try to meet Kim Jong-un, so I'm sure he's gonna try to make that happen again.
Wendy, you have the last word here.
So again, I think great week for the United States and President Trump in particular in Asia. But, these relationships require a lot of care and tending. And so the question will be, will we continue as the United States to pay such focused attention on the Asian region, both with respect to security and economic matters? And we know the president will be back in the region, at least in April, to visit China, and most probably will go to the APEC leaders meeting again next November. So I'm pretty optimistic that Asia will continue, not just China, but that Asia will continue to be a focused area of the administration. But the final word is that, as all of these countries, things are likely to pop up, and there's likely to be, developments that the White House will need to focus on and deal with. And so it's going to be very important that channels of communication with all of these countries continue very vigorously, in the coming weeks and months.
Great. I guess the devil is in the details. And speaking of the devil, I have a daughter who is dressing up as the devil, a devil. And I got to get to those duties shortly. But I want to thank the panel for a really wide-ranging discussion coming right on the heels of Trump returning. Remember to register for our next in-person event on November 6th on APEC outcomes, where I'm sure we'll have more to talk about from this trip. So thanks to everyone online for logging in, and particularly to our panelists for offering all of their wisdom. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks so
Happy
much,
Halloween.
Emma.
Thank you, Emma.